All right, we've got a holiday repost. This is my interview from last year with Scott H. Young, the author of Ultralearning and accomplisher of such feats as completing the MIT coursework for a computer science degree in some absurd amount of time, learning a bunch of languages, all kinds of great learning-related activities. But this conversation with Scott goes very nicely with the interview just recently posted with Cedric Chin from Common Cog, where we talk about tacit knowledge versus explicit knowledge, and Scott's book has all kinds of similar concepts and ideas, understanding Anders Ericsson's research, understanding how to apply various learning techniques and research-supported methodologies to get really good at picking up new things. So if you enjoyed the interview with Cedric, I think you will also enjoy this interview with Scott. If you haven't already, check out his book, again called Ultralearning, and he blogs regularly at scotthyoung.com as well. So Scott, you wrote a book about learning, and one of the chapters in the book discusses how it's really challenging to transfer information to people through things like books and courses and lectures and videos. But you did write a book about learning. So please defend this seeming contradiction.
Yeah. So I think it's important to have some nuance. So just for a little bit of background for the people who are just coming into this conversation, they have no idea what we're talking about. This ultra learning book, I've divided learning into different principles. And one of those is directness. And the idea of directness is that we learn best by doing the thing that we want to get good at, or when that's impossible to do, doing something similar. And so you're right, writing a book about learning when learning is about doing, not reading books, it sounds like a contradiction in terms. And it really isn't, but it's important to focus on what I think the default view of education is. And the default view is that learning is what happens when you sit in a classroom or you read a book and you get lectured to by someone else. That's learning. And then the homework is just, to show that you've learned it. And I want to flip that view on its head. I think that the doing is where the learning takes place, and books and lectures and classes, these are support structures for that learning. So again, it's a little bit of a nuanced perspective, because if we're looking at the low resolution version of my views, it is saying that, yeah, you should go out and do things and learn by doing as opposed to spending all your time reading books. But if, we don't have a video for this, but if you're looking at the video, I have a whole shelf of books and I read lots of books, and a lot of the learning projects I've done have involved books. And so I think the important thing is to put those books in their place. So the goal of a book is to give you sort of suggestions or advice or ideas that you can then take into practice. So when you're reading my book, if you just read it and you never do anything with it, it probably won't make a huge impact on your life. I think a lot of value in these books is often just giving you the inspiration or the idea to do things. But obviously, I think a good lesson in this book is that you will not become an ultra learner by reading my book. You will become an ultra learner when you start your first ultra learning project. And I'm hoping that what my book can do is convince you that ultra learning is a thing and something you might be interested in, and give you just that little nudge to get started. And then I think once you do get started, you'll find a lot of parallels between what you're experiencing and what I talk about in the book, and that can hopefully give you some tips for overcoming them.
Yeah, sure. And especially if you're thinking about, acquiring a new skill, which, as you mentioned, in some cases, directness in terms of like actually doing the skill very particularly is obviously one of the only ways that you're going to make any progress with it, right? Like everyone sort of intuitively understands that you can read all the books you want about playing guitar, but if you're not sitting there, struggling with chord shapes and screwing up your picking technique or whatever, that you're not going to get any better. Whereas in other areas, there might be a little bit more, obvious transfer from like a theoretical abstract idea surrounding, management or something, in terms of how you should potentially communicate to people, that can result in actual change behavior, as opposed to like this, just endless practice of a specific skill. How do you think about like separating those? Yeah.
So once again, I would say there's a lot of nuance to this idea. So again, the low resolution version is directness, learn directly. This will allow you to learn better. But there is a lot to this picture. And so one of the things is that it's not just about doing practice, but when you are trying to work on the skill you're trying to improve on, ask yourself how what you're doing to learn deviates from the way you're actually going to use it in real life. So we've obviously talked about when you just read a book, the activity of reading is different from how you're going to apply those ideas. So this can create transfer problems. Another thing that can create transfer problems is when the kind of practice you're doing isn't the right kind of practice. So it's not even just, oh, go play the guitar, but if you want to be able to play specific songs, you should try to practice for those specific songs. And so there are examples that I can think of that are quite clear where these transfer problems happen, but it's not obvious that that's what's going wrong. So in the book, I'm critical of Duolingo as an app for learning a language. And the reason I'm critical of it is actually really subtle. It's not because I think, well, apps are bad and you should never use an app. It's also not because, people have told me all sorts of reasons that they don't think Duolingo works. I don't think those are the core problem. I think the core problem is that if you look at one of the main activities they get you to do, they give you a sentence in English and then they give you a word bank in the language you're trying to learn so you can pluck out words and form a sentence. Now, the problem is that, yes, this is an activity where you're actually practicing. It's a little different from a book exercise, but the actual thing that's going on in your mind when you're doing this activity of picking words from a word bank is nothing like the actual activity of speaking, where you have to recall words from memory. The words aren't in front of you, and you don't have to choose from a very limited subset of all the words that you might know. And so in some ways, going through an actual textbook, which has a full sentence and then asks you to translate it, write it down, you try the whole sentence and then you look it up in the back of the textbook whether you got the answer right, is actually a much closer activity to speaking a language than this Duolingo example. So the idea of transfer and of directness it really has a lot of these subtleties to it that is more than just, we'll just do the thing, because often just doing the thing is hard or it's difficult or you don't know how to start doing it. And so it's all about how can you line up what you're doing, cognitively speaking, with the actual activity to get that benefit. And so even with book learning, I think, again, book learning can be quite helpful, but the question is, how are you applying that knowledge? And I think even for theoretical ideas, this directness comes into play. So one of the students I was advising when I was doing research for this book, he wanted to do a project to learn military history. Well, talk about a subject that doesn't have an obvious application. I mean, how are you going to apply, ancient Roman warfare tactics to, your real life? You're probably not. And that wasn't why he was learning it. It was because he wanted to understand it. But when we had conversations, we realized, well, what he wanted to be able to do was to talk kind of fluently about this subject with other experts and to be able to read other books and to be able to synthesize ideas. And so we came up with a project where he was going to write these little book reviews. So after each book, he was going to write a book review, kind of synthesizing the high level ideas of the book. And so this actually is a very good activity, because instead of just reading the book and then not having any idea of whether or not he's learned it effectively, by kind of putting together this little essay, he's understood it better and he knows he's applying it. And so it's thinking about learning in this way of, books and classes and resources are great, but at the end of the day, the learning is through doing. It's through doing some kind of practice, I think is a flip in mindset that I think is very important.
So if we kind of drill down on this idea of coming up with these almost drills that are effective versus ineffective, I mean, using the Duolingo as an example, potentially of an ineffective drill, and this concept overall of people attempting to have some sort of skill transfer between, the drills that they're doing and the actual activity that they're trying to do, that this is often a stumbling point for people, right? That people can make the error of attempting to, learn French to learn Spanish. And it's like, well, that's probably not the best way to do it. No. Although there may be some meta skill of language learning that could be beneficial. But on the other side as well, right, it's very difficult to figure out what exactly is the key piece of a skill that you're attempting to learn, such that it does translate over into the thing that you are hoping to accomplish. So do you have any, ways that you try to figure out, is this sort of isolated drill component translating or not?
So in the book, I talk about what I call the direct then drill approach, or directness then drill approach. And this idea is that the way we often think about learning is, again, it's not that drills are bad. If you were to try to learn basketball by only playing basketball games, never doing a passing, shooting, layup drill, you're probably not going to be optimally good at basketball. There's a reason that coaches do it this way. However, if you never played a game of basketball in your life and you only did layup drills and then suddenly you played a game, you might be surprisingly bad at it. And so what I tend to recommend is that a lot of classroom learning tends to start in the somewhat drill space. It tends to start in this abstracted, somewhat removed from the actual application environment. And then it's just expected that the student will apply it later. But often later is a long time later. Like if we're talking about a university university class, and maybe years later, by which time you maybe have forgotten a lot of it, you maybe have some of the knowledge decaying, and so it becomes somewhat inert. Whereas what I think the right way to do it is start off by having some kind of situation that largely resembles the one that you want to use. So if we're talking about something like learning a language, then just trying to have a very simple conversation really early on is a very useful skill to have. So even if you're looking stuff up in Google Translate, you're looking up things in the dictionary, having that kind of basic scaffolding, even though you don't know a lot of words, even though you don't know any grammar yet, even though you're just sort of parroting sentences that you see on the computer screen, this is still kind of a useful exercise to get that foundation in, so that when you do learn vocabulary, it always has this connection to, well, on Friday I have my conversation with my tutor, so maybe I'll use this word. So that would be one tip. That drills are important is sort of undeniable, but I think that they tend to come sort of logically, they come after the direct situation. So what happens is the direct situation, you experience the basketball game, you experience the song, and you realize that you suck at it and that you're not good at it, and it's overwhelming, that there's too much going on that you need to get better at. So drilling is really about breaking apart a skill so you can work on components separately, which is good because we usually can't keep very many things in mind at the same time. And so if you work on just learning a word, for instance, this is a cognitively simpler activity than speaking that word in a complicated sentence where you have to juggle pronunciation and grammar and trying to understand what the other person is saying and everything all at the same time. If you just learn it from a flashcard, that's going to be an easier task. So I think what's important is to maintain this interplay between doing drills to work on these skills in isolation and then bringing them back to the real world, or bringing them back to some kind of reasonable simulation of the activity that you want to perform the skill in, so that they can get integrated. Because I think if you only do a drill in isolation, there's often kind of missing connective tissue, to use kind of a muscle analogy, that like, you've built your bicep, but you don't have the tendons that connect it to your bones. So it's not very useful at lifting things. And so I think those kind of connective tissue is important. And often there's subtle things that are hard to predict when you start learning a skill. And the other thing that I think is important to realize as well is that when we learn things, that our brains tend to learn things in quite specific ways. So again, another model of education, which has been largely disproven, but has sort of persisted into our modern culture, is this idea that it doesn't matter what you learn, all the things you learn strengthen the mind. And so it didn't matter that, kids weren't using Latin. If we teach them Latin, they'll just be good at learning languages. And while that may be true in a very, very abstract sense, most of it doesn't transfer. So most of the words you learn in Latin don't transfer to learning a non-Romance language, for instance. And so what we learn tends to be quite specific. And so when you're designing drills, the specificity is super important. And so again, the reason that I'm somewhat skeptical of Duolingo is that if you look at, again, cognitively speaking, what you need to do when you're producing a sentence, it's actually not the same as picking words from a word bank. And so picking words from a word bank makes you feel good. It makes you feel like you're making progress, but maybe it doesn't matter so much.
Yeah, and I think that this idea of starting with the sort of direct task itself and then attempting to design drills based upon where you perceive struggles there, I mean, that makes so much sense. And some connections that I was making as you were talking almost have to do with like the amount of feedback that you can get from the task that you're working on, right? So, I mean, we sort of have the two examples that we're talking about of like language learning and attempting to, speak in a new language in a social environment and playing some sort of sport like basketball, that both of those things are pretty chaotic potentially, right? That there's a lot of stuff going on, and the actual feedback that you may be getting can be pretty decoupled from your actual performance, right? That like you may find that you're missing a bunch of shots, but it's not necessarily because you're, you could be a better shooter, but it's not necessarily just like your actual shooting that's going wrong. It's that, I'm good at shooting, but not good at shooting off the dribble. I'm only good at shooting in a catch and release situation, right? Or that like, maybe my actual conjugation is right, but my accent is bad. So no one can actually understand what I'm talking about. And so being able to think about, can I get out of a more chaotic situation and into a situation where I have more direct feedback through drilling on whether or not I'm doing this specific thing correctly, can potentially give more feedback that facilitates learning. Is that like a reasonable way of summarizing that?
I would say you're definitely on to something. I think your description is accurate. I actually separate out feedback as a separate process or a separate principle in learning than directness or than drilling. And there's actually some really interesting studies that have been done that do show that they think the two things are separate. So for instance, one of my favorite studies that I just love this study because it also introduces another principle that I wasn't thinking was a separate principle until I dug into the research, but I call it retrieval in the book. But basically, there was a study that had that was split into different groups. So I'm getting my studies confused. I'll make sure I'm saying the right study here. But they were split into different groups, and one group did repeated review, which means that they read a text and they just read it over and over again. There was another group that did concept mapping. And then there was a final group that did free recall. So concept mapping, just for those of you who don't know, is that thing where you like draw the central concept and then you put a bunch of arrows, try to make some kind of web of everything you know. And free recall is where you shut the book and you try to remember as much as you can. And so some interesting things about this study is, first of all, the free recallers did the best. They were the best performing of the groups. Another thing that was interesting is that when they asked students after they did the study, how well did they think they learned it before being tested, it was actually the repeated reviewers that thought they did it the best, which explains why that is a common studying tactic, even though it's actually fairly ineffective. But an interesting thing as well is that you would think, okay, well, what matters here is feedback, right? Because when you are testing yourself, you get feedback, whereas you don't get feedback when you're just doing review. And that's actually not true, because free recall actually improved performance even when students were not told anything about what they got wrong or missed in the study. So there is a value of doing retrieval, for instance, even apart from feedback. And similarly, when the final test was a concept map, so when what you were actually asked to do was to create a concept map that was being judged, free recall still did better than concept mapping, because cognitively speaking, what you're doing when you're concept mapping, when you have the book open, is actually different from what you're concept mapping when you are when you have the book closed, and the free recall is actually probably similar to that. So that there's a sense in which retrieval is also different from transfer. So one of the joys of writing this book was just kind of realizing how nuanced this picture is, and how, again, oh, it's feedback. Well, actually, maybe it's not feedback, and maybe even just doing direct practice is still valuable even if you have no feedback, or doing drills are still valuable even if you have no feedback, because you're still practicing the kind of cognitive circuits that you need to practice in order to perform the skill, even if you don't know whether you're doing it right or not. So, I mean, obviously feedback is good, directness is good, drill are good. These are all principles that are good, but I thought it was very interesting that you can design experiments that actually separate the effects of these things, and sometimes they even have effects even when you don't have feedback.
Do you remember what the topic was on the experiment with the concept mapping versus free recall?
I don't remember, but I remember it was some kind of text that had questions. So again, if you want to look it up, the study authors were Jeffrey Karpicki and Janelle Blunt. I don't remember them describing the content of the text, but I imagine it was, some kind of essay or something, and you had to answer questions about it in the end, something like that.
Sure. So the structure of it is essentially that you read a passage and then it's like,
I believe so. Don't cite me on that. I would read the actual paper by Karpicki and Blunt, because again, I don't quite remember what the content was or what the subject was, but I do seem to remember that was a lot of these studies in memory. They tend to like these, like, we're going to make a list of random words and pair them up and students are going to memorize it, which is kind of not like real life, even though it's easy to study psychologically speaking. Whereas I remember this task being something similar to what a student would actually do in school when they read some text and then they have to answer questions about it.
Yeah, so it seems like a principle that may be applicable there is that by putting yourself in a situation where you're sort of like forced to confront the limits of what you do understand or not understand, that seems to be a better way to learn overall, right? That these attempts to, do free recall or various forms of actual practice result in, the actual gaps in your knowledge or your skills becoming very apparent, which, as you mentioned, actually makes people feel almost worse about their performance, as opposed to things where they're able to just kind of, review passages that they already know and be like, yep, that sounds good, which doesn't build as much of a robust learning, so to speak.
So you're right that there is, again, this kind of self-generated feedback feedback that when you do free recall, you realize how much you don't remember for something. But I think even more precisely, what I would kind of impress upon people is that recall is actually a kind of complicated process, that in order to, we tend to think of this computer metaphor when we're thinking about either memories or skills, in that we think, oh, well, I've learned it, so it's saved in my brain. And so, accessing it's just like accessing a computer file. You just bring up that memory and there you go. Whereas in practice, I think recall is actually sort of a sophisticated process, and that it tends to be related to a certain set of cues. So very often what's difficult about learning is not getting knowledge in your head at all, but rather how can you get it back out of your head when you're presented with the right questions or the right situations where it's appropriate. And so that is why I think recall and retrieval is a more effective learning tactic, is because you are actually strengthening the ability to bring this information out, either given a prompt or even without a prompt, even just thinking about the topic. Whereas the students who do repeated review, when they see the information, it is becoming more and more familiar. So there is a certain sense in which that knowledge is inside their head, but that knowledge that's inside their head isn't necessarily in a form that's useful, because if you can only access the knowledge when you see it in front of you, it's going to have a much lower domain of applicability than if you can recall it, for instance, when someone asks you a question where that might be the answer. And I know we're talking about recall and this applies to academic knowledge, but really it applies to all sorts of skills. So, we were talking about, dribbling and doing layups and stuff. And a lot of what you're trying to do in those situations is activating these motor programs to shoot the ball, given a certain set of cues or given a certain set of things going on in the environment. And if those cues change, if you can't activate that motor program, if you can't actually execute those steps and muscular movements to shoot the ball properly, you won't perform as well.
Yeah, and there's potentially an issue too with learning something in one context and then attempting to apply it in a more performative context, which is something that we've actually struggled with coaches at my gym, right? That we spend a decent amount of time like reviewing a lot of concepts surrounding movement and mobility or program design or various ways to coach people, understanding people's kind of like emotional cues, all this stuff, and there's a huge disconnect between, can we talk about this in a coaches meeting and people have insight and understanding and the ability to potentially write something on the board, and then what's like, great, now go out and stand on the floor and you're presented with a problem where someone does have a shoulder mobility issue or is being standoffish or whatever, people just revert immediately to their sort of default behavior and have a really hard time actually connecting the the sort of more like classroom environment to a real scenario. So how do you think about bridging that gap?
Yeah. Well, I think, again, there's two things that we can talk about. So you're talking about a little bit from the educator's perspective of like, how can we bridge that gap for students? And I think this has been a problem that has been perennial in education. Like, again, if you look at the literature on transfer, it has been researchers banging their head against a wall of like, we teach students and it's obvious that they should apply it here, and then they don't. Why? And I don't know whether there's a really good example for that. I think that to quote one of the researchers, we must just kind of come to expect that the subject matter will tend to be welded to the situations and contexts in which we find it. It's a little bit of a paraphrase rather than an exact quote, but that this was sort of the finding of it. And this has been coming up again and again and again. So from an educator's perspective, I think it's rather arrogant for me to say I have the solution, because this has been a problem in all classrooms for decades, despite enormous research and very bright minds working on it. However, from the learner's perspective, I think there's a lot you can do, because, again, it's like you can bring a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. And so I think for a lot of students, they're not actively looking for how they can apply skills. They're not seeking that feedback. They're not seeking that application. And so if you take that initiative as a learner to say, okay, they're teaching me something here, how am I going to go apply that in real life? And then you go and apply it in real life pretty soon, and you kind of take that experience back to the classroom. You enter into a feedback loop where you are going to be much better at transfer. The other thing I think that is sort of from the research which indicates this is that we tend to be better at transfer the more knowledge we've acquired. So I think part of the problem with these studies is that they are very small scale. And so they involve teaching someone something over a few lessons, and then they get to apply it and then they don't. Whereas if you deal with something that, for instance, you've been working in a domain for years, you're much more easily able to see those connections between what you're learning and where you could apply it. And to be honest, this is sort of why there's a paradox of transfer in the first place, because if experts didn't see that it was obvious to transfer A to B, then, they wouldn't think that it was weird that students can't do it or novices can't do it. And so I think that is a little bit of the escape hatch, that once you get a lot better at something, you are better at transferring it. Once you learn it more deeply, you are better at transferring it. It's just that we tend not to start out with that kind of knowledge. So I think from a learner's perspective, there is steps that we can take to learn directly. And I think as an educator, all we can do is really encourage students to take those steps and provide them opportunities to apply their knowledge. But at the same time, we should be humble about how well they'll be able to do that without very explicit instruction.
And why do you think that experts are better at transfer? I mean, surface level, like, yeah, sure, experts are probably going to be better at everything, but there's probably, you probably have some theories about the way that they're either, mapping the different processes that they're thinking about, or making connections compared to either novice or intermediate folks.
Well, now we're going into a little bit uncharted waters, because there's still a lot of speculation about how experts think and process information. There's competing models and stuff. But since you ask, I will weigh in on my very unqualified opinion.
Let's just speculate wildly.
Yeah, let's just speculate wildly. So we'll just have that warning up on the screen that like that I'm not a scientist will just blare with some klaxons in the background. But so I did some research on this kind of expertise in my chapter on intuition. And I found it very interesting, because we often look at this sort of expert facility with being able to do seemingly almost magical things with knowledge. So the guy that I covered there was Richard Feynman, who's a Nobel Prize winning physicist, who was somewhat famous for just being extremely brilliant. And what I found digging into the research and also into his biography is that this kind of expertise is actually built out of many, many, many overlapping patterns that come from having kind of not only experience with a subject, but experience in a kind of extensive way of playing with it. And so one of the early studies on the phenomenon known as chunking had to do with chess novices and masters. And so what they did is they took a chessboard and put a chess position down, and then they took the chess pieces away and asked the subjects to recreate it. And what they noticed was that chess novices tend to put the pieces down one at a time, and as a result, they can't remember most of the board. Whereas masters tend to put down configurations of multiple pieces all down at once. And the reasoning they felt is that by exposure to constant chess games, certain patterns and configurations in chess tend to become salient and jump out, even though that they're at a kind of abstract level. So for anyone who hasn't played chess before, some of these terms are not going to be super familiar to you, but if you've ever played a little bit of chess, you will know things like a fork. So for instance, a knight can maybe fork two different pieces at once. And what's different is that a novice would say, oh, well, the knight was here, the king was here, the queen was here, whereas a chess master would immediately think fork, and it's just one big pattern, and they would say, these three pieces all go together because they were part of that pattern. Then I know there was a fork there. And this sounds really abstract, but we use this ability all the time. So the one that I often do in the book is I'll say something like will be an example, like FMW, BBW, IAW. So, okay, now can you repeat those letters back to me? And a lot of people, you maybe if you really remember it, you could repeat those letters back to you. But if I said FBI, MBA, WWW, you'd remember them instantly, right? And the reason why is that
I will interrupt and say that BBW is a chunk for a lot of people.
Well, I was just trying to go the letters in sequence. I would not safe for work, guys. Anyways, so when we're talking about these chunks, these three chunks, you recognize them immediately, and you can work with them almost as if they're single objects rather than complicated composites of many components. And so when we're talking about expertise, I'm not saying that everything necessarily follows this chunking analogy, but I think it's a useful kind of starting point to think about how we acquire this sort of expert intuition, is that if you have tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of these chunks in your mind about a particular subject, you can see patterns that other people can't see. And you can see these patterns in other places. And so while the novices see chess pieces, the experts see, this is the King's Indian defense, and this is the, whatever variation. And this is, this is clearly going to be a checkmate in 6 moves because they've seen that in a game before. And it's not because the chess master is so much smarter than you are, but because they have all these stored patterns. And so when we're talking about transferring things and go to your original question of why can experts do this and novices can't, is because for novices, the world is like a buzzing confusion of sort of tons and tons of little chunks that they can't assemble together in their mind. So they literally don't see the patterns that an expert can see. And the only way that they can see those patterns is to have enough experience. And so there is a certain kind of tragic irony to this, that it means that, if you really want to be able to transfer things, you need to learn a lot. But the advantage as well is that when you're starting out, if those chunks really resemble the situations you're dealing with, you're going to be much more effective. So I suggest directness as a way of learning lots of skills, because I think it gives you that kind of immediate bang for your buck. But even in the long run, I think it's a more stable process to acquiring mastery.
And, there's almost like a potentially an escape velocity that you can hit once you start to learn enough to potentially be able to chunk effectively for whatever skill you're attempting to learn, because then all of a sudden you have enough resolution to have a clearer idea of what specific problems you are attempting to solve, right? Where it's like, this guy has good shoulder mobility in this situation, but not in this situation. Mm-hmm. And he has pain when he goes over here, but not when he goes over here. And as an expert, you're able to sort of say, that's kind of weird. That doesn't make sense. That's a strange scenario. Yeah. Like, what's actually going on there? And that becomes like a salient example that then you want to try to solve. So then you're able to focus in on that and figure out what's going on, as opposed to potentially, a more novice coach might not be able to parse out all those differences, and it's just like another confusing area.
Exactly. And like, you can think of doctors in this way too, that a doctor hears about a patient and they describe some symptoms and they kind of like, well, maybe it's this. And in order to say, well, maybe it's this, they have to have an incredibly deep understanding of human physiology, of, different processes that are going on in the body. So there's this really complicated background knowledge, so that when you say you have certain symptoms, okay, but you don't have this symptom, so it's probably not that. Or, there is a, if you were to describe it in a flow chart, it might be quite complicated. And the flow chart might not even fully capture what doctors are doing, which is, part of the reason WebMD sucks, is that, they've got the flow chart, but, I've got a cold. Well, maybe it's cancer. Like, this is the joke. But I think it's because the patterns and knowledge that are, in the beginning are kind of drilled into students in terms of, well, there's this drug interaction or there's this kind of thing. And it starts as this kind of fairly formal declarative knowledge. It needs to be internalized through doing your residency, through working with patients, so that it becomes a kind of intuitive knowledge.
Yeah. And that the intuitive knowledge then allows almost like a better, less intuitive knowledge in terms of like really turning over problems in your mind, because you're not just lost in the sort of like chaos of everything happening.
Yeah.
So I was thinking about what you were saying about this transfer problem, and something that I will wildly speculate on.
Sure.
Is that, I think that a lot of people potentially struggle to transfer knowledge when they're not attempting to solve a problem, mm-hmm. right? That they can potentially learn something in like a classroom environment or from reading a book or watching a video, but if they don't understand how that tangibly solves a problem for them in whatever domain they're working on, that transfer is difficult. Whereas, like you're talking about with experts, they maybe have a much better idea of specific scenarios and specific problems that they're trying to solve. So it's easier for them to then make connections to like more abstract knowledge to like a very tangible piece of like, that reminds me of this one weird scenario, like we were talking about with a doctor, where they're like, that patient, like that kind of didn't make sense. Maybe this is a connection there. Does that seem like a reasonable way of framing that?
That does seem reasonable. You know what I'll say as a little anecdote. So I remember giving a speech on this topic, and I talked about this whole issue of transfer and why we should learn directly as learners. And I remember I was kind of a little bit derisive of my business school education that I got years ago. And I remember after the speech, I'm going down and I'm talking to a woman, and she's like, you know what? I actually teach at a business school. So there's a little bit of that like pulling the collar moment of like, oh, geez. Okay. Ooh, all right. And she was like, you know what? I completely agree with you. And we try to do this she's saying in my classroom, that I try to get the students to apply these things, and they say, no, I don't care. I don't want to do the homework. And so this is something interesting for me, because I think when I'm talking about these things, a lot of people will have this attitude of like, oh, those darn teachers and educators, they're not doing it properly. And that's not my message at all. I wanted to write a book for learners, because as we're talking about, there's only so much you can do as the educator. You can create a great curriculum. You can provide opportunities for real life practice. But if the student doesn't want to do those, if they're just there to pass the test, or if they're just there to, I'm doing my part because I'm sitting passively in the classroom, barely paying attention, so it's your fault if I don't learn this. I wanted to write a book where I said, this is what you should be doing if you actually care about being good at things, if you actually care about learning things. This is what you should be doing. And so, yes, it's true that sometimes classrooms make mistakes. And I've definitely been in classrooms where I think teachers are not approaching it the right way. But I think we also have to take our own responsibility and our own initiative when we're learning things to say, okay, here are some problems that I can apply this to. So like what you're saying about, experts knowing about problems, learners can do that too. Like if we're starting to learn a new language and I'm like, well, what do you want to use it for? And you're like, well, I don't know. Or like, where are you going to start using it? Well, if you start thinking about, well, I've got a trip to Paris coming up and I want to learn some French. Okay, great. Let's work through some scenarios where maybe you're ordering coffee at a restaurant, or, you're getting a croissant, or you're asking where the nearest metro station is. Okay, now we're actually solving real problems for you. And so those are going to transfer a lot better than I just teach you how to conjugate avoir in French. Like, who cares about that? Help me get to the metro station. And so I think as learners, we often take a passive back seat, expecting that the teacher and educator, they know best, they're going to tell us what to learn. And part of that is reinforced by the formal education system, where as learners, we don't have a lot of autonomy. But I think as adults, as people listening to this podcast right now, you shouldn't take those habits into your own learning. You should take initiative and say, this is what I want to learn. These are the problems I want to be able to solve. And when you keep those things in mind, you're going to be much more effective.
And are there traits that you think are necessary for someone to have that level of motivation to try to work on their own problems? Like, is there something that makes someone into the type of person who will figure out how to learn stuff versus someone who might not? Or is it something that is more, like people can figure it out if they're sufficiently motivated?
Well, here, I'll put it this way. So a lot of people worry about intelligence, and that's a worry that has some grounding in truth, because there are people who are smarter than you. There are a lot of people who are smarter than me too. And I think that worry can translate into, well, maybe I can't use this because I'm not smart enough. But I found in real life that although this may be a worry at some of the extremes, like if you're trying to become a Nobel Prize winning physicist and you're quite dull in math, maybe you can't. I don't know. But most people aren't trying to become a Nobel Prize winning physicist. They're just trying to learn things that matter to them. And I think that there is a kind of unconscious adaptation of, well, I'd like to learn this, but I don't know how. And so my feeling is that the biggest obstacle is that there are a lot of people who aren't going to listen to this podcast, Todd. Let's be honest. When we're talking about learning, there's a lot of people whose eyes glaze over as soon as we mention the subject, that they're saying, well, I don't care about any of that, And so if you're one of the people listening to this right now, if you're interested in what we're talking about, I feel you're already in the kind of privileged minority that cares about learning. And so I think that's the biggest hurdle to overcome. So when we're talking about traits, I think we are talking about a specialized group of people, just because most people, in my opinion, don't care that much about learning things. They don't care that much about getting better at things. And so if you're one of those people that actually cares and you'd actually like to be able to learn something new and you're actually willing to put in a bit of effort to do that, you're already in that minority. And I think you've accomplished the best thing. And so to actually do it well then is mostly a little bit of adjustment. It's mostly about understanding some of these principles so you don't make really obvious mistakes. There's going to be lots of learning. There's going to be lots of stumbling. Even today, when I start a new learning project, I make stupid mistakes and I go off on tangents that turn out to be dead ends. But in the same sense, because I know kind of the general principles of how learning works, I don't make really bad mistakes where, I do something, well, that's obviously not going to work for learning this skill. And so I tend to start in the right ballpark, even if I don't always pursue the most efficient strategy. And so I think what I want to do with this book is, again, for that minority of people that have that intrinsic desire to get better at things, that they are going to look at the principles and be like, oh, this is why it was not working for me when I was trying to learn guitar, or when I was trying trying to learn French or when I was trying to learn basketball, I should have been doing this instead. And I'm hoping those little aha moments will give people the little tweaks they need to change their motivation and their approach.
Yeah, and to kind of circle back on the, intelligence or talent or whatever discussion, I do also think that it's sort of like you're saying, people think of it as like a ceiling on their ability, which in some cases may be true. But a lot of the time it's also like a rate of adaptation, right? Some people are going to improve more quickly than others, but that doesn't mean that other people can't also just improve, right? It just might not be as fast as they think that they should be improving, or as they potentially see someone else improving, which can then sort of result in them, thinking badly about their own ability. But it's just like, well, everyone is going to have a different rate of adaptation over time.
Well, so one of the things I would say as well is that, again, I think this misperception that, well, I'm just not smart enough to learn X is a kind of holdover from the classroom environment. And it's not a statement of talent and intelligence don't exist, or that there's no differences between people, or that all our differences are overcomable by experience. I'm not saying that. But what I am saying is that you go to a classroom and you're at the bottom of the class, there is a pervasive feeling that you're not good at this and you should drop out. And the problem is that the one-to-many style of education that we're working on, where one teacher is teaching to 30, or if it's in a college, maybe 100, 200, 300 students, they're naturally going to adjust the pace to the median student. And the unfortunate part is sometimes the median student has prior knowledge. I mean, if we were to go back a few hundred years and you were to try to talk to someone about, well, I'm reading this book, they would think you're a genius, right? Because literacy rates were abysmally low. Now, it isn't because modern day people are 100 times smarter. It's just because the median student today can read and write, right? Or the median student today can do basic arithmetic. Again, another, genius level skill from 500 years ago. And so I think that's part of the problem, is that we draw these inferences about what we're capable of doing by these kind of relative assessments of, well, are we the best at this? And so I think this is unfortunate, because while, it is often useful to gravitate to your strengths and work on things that you're good at, I think sometimes people will want to work on something that they are really interested in, but there's some small part of it that scares them and they hold them back. So they want to become a doctor, but, well, I just can't do organic chemistry. Or they want to become, a programmer, but they can't get over that math class that's in their required CS curriculum. Or they want to do X, but they don't have some of the foundation. And so they just say, you know what, I can't do it, or I give up. And so I really think that the ability to learn things, especially if you understand the learning process and you're patient with yourself and you have that effort and enthusiasm, that there's almost nothing that you can't learn. I feel like there's very few limitations where, well, no person, if you're below this level of intelligence, can learn X. I think that those things are indeed extremely rare. Now, it may be the case that you require more work, or you require tailoring your kind of learning process so that you start off a little bit slower as you build that foundation. Like, I think that's definitely something that can happen. But whether or not, you just can't learn X, I think those are actually quite rare in reality.
Yeah, and you mentioned a few things that people, easily tend to get stuck on, or say, I'm not the type of person who can do this, as far as like organic chemistry or computer science or something, right? And you've obviously made some waves on the internet with your MIT challenge, and as someone myself who's let's say a lower level intermediate, like self-taught computer programmer, like who hacks software together, a lot of the time spent working on programming or chemistry, or honestly just about anything, is spent doing something that you kind of don't actually know how to do, and you feel stupid and frustrated, right? Because like the stuff you know how to do, you already know how to do it, so like you don't spend any time on it because you just do it, and then you're like, oh well, here's the thing that I'm stuck on, and so all your time is just like being frustrated and feeling dumb. So how do you think about like plateauing as you're learning, as well as this concept of just like, well, almost by definition, you're going to almost spend all of your time at the thing you can't do yet?
So I remember having a conversation with a programmer, and he said that the fundamental skill of programming is just being okay being frustrated. And I thought that was very funny, because I think that that's kind of true. A lot of people take the frustration to be a sign that they can't learn to program, or that they're no good at this, when it's really the opposite, that frustration is kind of programming. And as you get better at it, the frustration turns from being oh, I'm not good at this, and that kind of negative, eats you up inside sort of mental self-talk, to being, this is a puzzle and I like puzzles and puzzles are fun, right? But the thing that makes puzzles fun is that they're frustrating, that you don't know how to solve them, right? As soon as you know how to solve them, they're not a puzzle anymore. And so programming and many, many skills are kind of like little puzzles. I would say even writing as a writer is often a little puzzle. It's a little bit like, well, I've got this idea and this anecdote, and I've got this practical advice, and some of these ideas bubbling up in my head. And so how do I piece them all together so that it's something people will actually want to read? And so I think viewing your frustrations as puzzles takes some time, and it takes getting to a place of confidence and of safety. I think that, again, a lot of people have negative experiences from college or from school because when they were doing bad, it meant, well, you're failing this class, or it meant that, well, everyone's, looking at you and you're embarrassed and this kind of thing. And so I think there's a lot of emotional baggage that we have about this, but really learning is kind of like solving little puzzles, and it's really putting these things together. And if you have the right attitude, that's kind of the same thing as frustration, although it's in kind of a positive way. So I think a lot of people struggle with that.
Yeah, and I think that there's probably variation too in terms of when things are easy to either just feel like a puzzle automatically or like reframe, right? So I know for myself, I'm perfectly content to, fiddle with some computer thing that I don't know how to do and try to figure it out. And it may be frustrating, but I'm like happily engaged in the process. But then I'm trying to change like the windshield wipers on my car. And, the YouTube video is like somehow slightly different from my actual car. Mm-hmm. And I'm immediately just like, this is stupid. I hate this. Why am I doing this?
Yeah.
I'm just like unwilling to push through.
And this is a human universal too. So I'm not talking about this in some condescending, like, well, you should stop, be frustrating, it's a puzzle. I was recently learning salsa dancing. I started in about January, and I went with my wife to some classes. Nothing really particularly special. I'm not going to be bragging about how great a salsa dancer I am anytime soon. But I was going to these classes, and my wife has done some dancing before. So she's a little bit more kind of confident generally with these kind of body movements and rhythmic stuff. And I don't really have a background in that. And I was not doing super well. Like, I didn't feel like I was very good in the class. And that's a little embarrassing. And especially when you're doing like the partner dancing. And so the partners go around and you can't figure it out with one partner. And then it's like, okay, everybody high five, rotate. And then there's a new partner and you're like, yeah, sorry, I don't know how to do this. And you're doing it again. And I remember going to some early classes, and the overwhelming voice in my head was, I hate this. This is awful. And so like, I'm the guy writing a book about learning, telling people they should learn hard things. And my inner voice is literally saying everything that I'm avoiding. Like, I hate this. You're not good at this. You should stop. And so my point that I'm trying to make is that everyone feels this way. And it's not for me to say, oh, well, once you reach this status as an ultra learner, then you're never going to have these problems in life. But that there's always going to be something for you that causes you this frustration. But the thing is that if you can push through that, or if you can recognize that voice, is a choice, that you are making a choice to sort of have this reaction to it, and you keep going and you sort of accept that, well, actually people aren't laughing at you, or actually, you know what, you are bad at this, but that's what learning is about. And if you were good at it, you wouldn't be going to the class, and et cetera, et cetera. And you rationalize and you push through it. And after you push through it a bit, you start to, oh, actually I got it that time. And that feels pretty good. And actually this is pretty fun. And I know, I haven't reached this point with salsa, but I know this point from learning languages, for instance, that the, oh my God, I suck at this, I hate this stage becomes the, oh, I actually had a positive interaction, to the, oh, wow, this is such a enriching, positive experience in my life. So I really find it funny that how hardwired and unconscious these feelings that we have about learning are. And so if you feel bad about learning something, just realize you're in good company and that there's nothing to be ashamed of, but also recognize that if you can push through it, those feelings will change. And so I think that's something that a lot of people struggle with because they haven't had enough positive experiences to convince them that there is a light at the end of the tunnel.
Yeah, and related to that, I think a lot of people also probably experience perfectionism, right, when they're trying to get started with something. I mean, we see this all the time, like coaching people in movement, right? That, okay, we're going to work on the barbell clean, and okay, it's all messed up, but we're going to like step by step figure it out. And like people are just furious with themselves that they don't have it figured out in, the first 10 times they've done the movement. And it's like, yeah. Sir, you will have to do this like literally 6,000 more times before it's actually okay. Like you're going to do 5,999 wrong reps before your first actual right one.
Well,
like, are you prepared for that?
Yeah. And you know what? It's funny because I think I feel this pressure for myself because I become kind of the learning guy. I like do learning projects and I'm good at things. And to be honest, that's a sort of an oxymoron because to be good at learning things is to be really comfortable with being bad at things. And so I've had that in situations where like my own ego about like, well, I should be good at this and I'm not, can actually conflict with my process. So often I find it's the people who their self-conception is that they're smart, that they are actually the worst learners, because anytime they don't get something immediately, they're like, they're, oh, wow, this is breaking my self-conception. And so I have to give up on this. And so it's been something for me to really train myself to be like, you know what, I actually have to fail and embarrass myself and be bad at things, because only by being bad at things can you get good at things. And so for me, even like, I did a recent project where I was learning quantum mechanics, and no surprise, it's quite hard, and I found it difficult, and it had been years since I had done a lot of the prerequisite subjects, so I was also failing on a lot of things that I should have been knowing before even starting the class. And I decided, of all things, to do this live streamed. And definitely I'm feeling the sweating thing because a lot of people are like, well, I have to watch this because Scott's so good at things, and I'm screwing up like easy stuff, like I'm getting lots of stuff wrong, and people are in the comments like, no, you made a mistake there, it's this, and I'm like, wait, what are they talking about? And this kind of thing. And the thing that I've just kind of learned for myself is that I have to, as someone who's going to be learning and doing things, I just have to be okay with being an idiot and being bad at things. And like, you know what, let's just embarrass ourselves and not worry about it, not try to do this. So for me, there's a kind of irony because while I'm talking about ultra learning and I'm talking about it being this sort of unapproachable thing, it's really just, you know what, I'm going to dive into this with all my heart and I'm going to really try to do what matters, and not like because I'm going to succeed. Obviously, that's something that a lot of people do when they actually go through this process. But the feeling of doing it is, you know what, if I'm going to fail, I'm going to fall right on my face, but who cares? And so, you know, a lot of my projects start that way where I'm like, well, I have no idea how this is going to turn out. But I think when you have that attitude, it actually turns out better than if you start with this preconceived notion that you're going to become some expert or genius in a short period of time.
Based upon your quantum mechanics study, do you have an opinion on what actually happens when we collapse wave functions? Are you a many worlds guy? Copenhagen interpretation?
Yeah, I don't know. See, I don't know. I think I probably lean many worlds in the interpretation, but I also think the interpretation maybe matters less than people think it does. I think the thing that is weird, which a lot of people think the thing that's weird about quantum mechanics is that it's random. And I don't think that that is the thing that we should think is weird. The thing that we should think is weird is that measurement apparatus, which are really just made out of many, many small quantum things, seem to do something different than the individual things themselves. So I think that's the mystery to explain. And I think many worlds is probably a better explanation than just it collapses, because obviously that's something physical going on. And it would be weird that, you know, the laws of physics work differently for big things than small things. I mean, not impossible, but it would be weird. Whereas the randomness, I don't think is a thing that's entirely weird. And honestly, I think understanding the math behind quantum mechanics is kind of frightening a little bit. But I think if you do start to understand it, it's just amazing how much of our world, well, all of our world really, but how much of it kind of directly owes its explanation to things that are happening quantum mechanically.
Yeah, that's really interesting stuff. My favorite classes in college were my physical chemistry classes. And I recently pulled out my notebooks for PChem. I could not understand literally anything.
Yeah.
Like, oh no, these symbols make no sense to me anymore.
Well, I think that happens too. Like we were talking about learning, but honestly maintaining knowledge and the degradation of knowledge is a huge problem. And I think one of the rules of thumb is that any knowledge that you don't actively use on a regular basis will start to decay. And so one of the problems of that is that you can often learn something that you are not planning on using every day, but you would like to use it one day. So the best example of that is learning a language, right? And for me, I did this language learning trip, which I'm not sure whether you'll mention or you have mentioned in the introduction, but going back in time, obviously, is I did this project with a friend where we went to learn 4 different languages in 4 different countries using this no English rule. So we went to Spain, Brazil, China, and South Korea to learn these languages. And obviously, I feel like we learned them fairly well given the time constraints. I think you can go onto my website and have actual recordings of me talking if you're not sure what level we reached. And the thing about that, though, is that if you don't do any practice after that, you will forget those languages. And that's something I think a lot of people don't really anticipate because they think the difficulty is learning the language. But very often, if you don't live in the country that speaks it, it's maintaining the language. And so I was actually pretty rigorous about setting up a schedule for doing just a little bit of practice. It's not a large time investment, but it is something you have to be systematic about because if you don't practice them, you haven't practiced the language in a year and you go to speak it, you're going to be quite rusty. And so especially immediately after you learn something, I think doing some spaced practice of it later on is important. And there is also some interesting work if we're talking about like chemistry or something, that a good way of doing that with theoretical subjects is to learn the next class. So for me, I felt like doing this quantum mechanics project, it was good to learn quantum mechanics, but it was also really good for me to like get that refresher on all the calculus and differential equations and physics and stuff that, I had studied in the MIT challenge about 8 years ago, but haven't used it actively since.
Yeah, I have a book on classical field theory that was gifted to me as kind of like, okay, let's maybe attempt to dig back into some of this stuff because it is also something that I personally just like enjoyed doing math and physics like that.
Nice.
And just not touching it for a long time, and it's really interesting what remains and what doesn't remain, right? Is that some of the like understandings of like the way to think about problems and like the abstractions are still there, but the actual mechanics of the math is just like completely long gone.
Definitely. And I think that's very common. I think that that's kind of what you would hope, though, from learning those subjects, I think, is that especially if you're not in the regular habit of solving physics problems, then remembering, like for me, I forgot integrating by parts. That was some of the things I was like, well, I know that exists as a thing, but I forgot what's what it is. It's like U and V and there's all these, like, it's a formula and I'd forgotten it and I had to practice it to get better at it again. Now, what you'd like to remember, hopefully at least, is, again, just that you have some little mental tag in your head. Oh yeah, integration by parts is a thing and it's used for these situations. Or even more abstractly, like, you might need to use integration for this kind of problem. And I think that's what we'd like to preserve from knowledge. So I don't think that decay is necessarily a problem with these kinds of subjects. For instance, like a lot of the stuff I learned in the MIT challenge, I've probably forgotten the details of. I mean, it was almost a decade ago. But I would say that what I have learned and what has been retained is a lot of kind of higher level ideas about computation generally, so that when I open a book about computer cognitive science, for instance, and they're talking about, models of how the brain works, a lot of these abstract ideas kind of come into play because I have some sort of intuitive notions of, how would you compute things and what are some procedures of how you would calculate stuff. And so these things come into play when you're evaluating models people have of learning, let's say.
Yeah, for sure. So to kind of switch gears into more of like a big picture idea surrounding, some people approaching ultra learning and autodidactism and other people not. Something I've been thinking about related to your book and just the overall, information that we have available on the internet is that, like you were saying earlier, there's almost a self-selection of people who are interested in this type of process of struggling with something and figuring things out on their own, and that a lot of people are not necessarily interested in that. So there's almost like a bifurcation between folks who are like really serious about learning and getting better at stuff and people who are not as serious about that. Do you have any thoughts on, where we might be heading, just like big picture with, this potential splitting of different groups of people, or potentially how to make it more interesting to other people to actually like marshal the resources available to them to actually self-educate on stuff? Right.
Well, I think, again, a lot of this has to do with our prior experiences. So, for instance, I think that it's unfortunate, but a lot of people, as soon as you say learning, they think school and studying, which I think learning is a much, much broader topic than just studying in school. That's a fairly narrow area of learning. But a lot of people make that kind of inference that when I'm talking about learning, I'm talking about school. And if you had bad experiences in school, then that sort of has an unpleasant kind of emotional valence associated to it. So when I talk about learning and you had school and you're thinking about that test that you were studying for and gives you stomach cramps, then when I'm talking about it, you tune out and you say, well, I don't care about that. Even if, let's say, in your regular life, maybe with your car, you're always tinkering with it, right? Or you fix things around the house all the time. And maybe that's not school, but it's still learning, right? So I would say that there is a kind of, depending on what your past experiences, you can either develop confidence or you can develop a kind of negative association with things. And you can overcome that negative association, but it's often difficult and it's not automatic. So, some people are the opposite. Maybe you did really great in school, but you don't fix anything in your house because that one time you tried to fix a sink, you caused a plumbing leak and it cost $1,000 to fix everything. Example, right? So I think our attitudes about learning are informed largely by our past experiences, and that can be good or bad. And it can also be good in some domains and bad in other domains. So that's one thing. The other thing I think is that as we get into a more complicated area of work, so one of the areas of research that I cover in my book is MIT economist David Autor's study of skill polarization, which is basically that income inequality is going up in the world, which means the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. But more importantly than that, it seems like the middle class is the thing that's getting squeezed out. So a lot of our cultural assumptions about what you need to do to have a successful life are quickly becoming outdated. And the outdated idea is that you could go to school, learn a little bit, maybe not even go to university, work at the same job, figure it out, do the same job 9 to 5 every day, earn a good salary, have a nice house and 2 cars and just live that life. And that will be great for you. And instead, I think what we're noticing is that you're either going to be squeezed into the lower paying jobs where life is a struggle and you don't earn a lot of money. Or if you want to survive, you're going to be in a zone where learning is constant. And so the idea that you learn everything that you need to do in your degree or in your first year or two on the job is going to evaporate. And really you constantly have to be reinventing yourself. You constantly have to be upgrading your skills. And so I think for the people who have this tinkering, figuring it out, I'm good at learning kind of background of experience, not to mention maybe some intellectual capabilities that foster that, they're going to be the ones that gravitate towards these professions. They're going to be the ones that, struggle with things, figure things out and become successful. And there's going to be a lot of people that I think they're up for a rude awakening when their career gets, replaced by a computer or gets replaced by someone overseas who's willing to do it for a tenth the cost. And I think that this is driving a lot of these society-wide things that we're seeing is this kind of dual reaction to having to learn continuously.
You've mentioned that The Secret of Our Success is one of your favorite books before, which to just give like a super broad synopsis, a lot of it is just about cultural learning and the way that humans just sort of are very good at essentially copying each other, right? That we can just sort of like look at what someone else is doing, particularly high status or high prestige individuals, and just sort of like start copying everything that they do, and that can sort of like pass between different individuals and then create these cultural groups that are able to have traditions that then facilitate their success, right? So like very broad strokes idea surrounding what's going on in that book, which I actually read recently and really enjoyed. I've been thinking about, okay, if people are very good at this sort of like copying of other individuals, but maybe not as good at this sort of like, okay, I'm going to take something on myself and figure out how to do it. Is there a way to potentially like bridge that gap and make it, almost prestigious to be this type of self-educating person so that then people copy the behaviors necessary to self-educate?
I don't know. I think, so one of the things, this is again, a little bit beyond the scope of what we're talking about for my book a little bit, but one of the subjects that I've been very interested in, because I mentioned I did a project where I was live streaming, because one of the things I think people have gotten wrong, or I don't want to say have gotten wrong, but is maybe not the ideal way to inform people, is that we've modeled on this classroom learning situation where you take some expert or someone who knows something and they design a curriculum. So they try to abstract out what they think the lessons are that matter. What should I teach people? And so already you have a flawed process, because probably a lot of what they've learned that actually makes them perform well is tacit. It's not something that they're even consciously aware of. And so as soon as you have someone designing a curriculum, already they're getting on their hobby horse about, well, X is important or Y is important. And maybe it is, maybe it isn't, right? And so that's already a problem. But then the second problem is that people don't generally learn very well just by being lectured at, right? Like the way that you often learn well is by witnessing someone do something, like we just said, and then you emulate it. That's a very deep learning behavior, and that the lecturing model, I think, is somewhat inferior to that. And so, including books. So, I mean, we're having a conversation where we're lecturing at the listeners right now. So I am aware of the irony. But but I think for me, that's been a big goal of mine, is how can we overcome that? And I think technology actually does have a place for that. And so I think one of the places technology has a place is if you watch someone performing a skill through, let's say, a live stream where you can ask them questions and stuff. And I think what's interesting about that is that because it reveals everything, it shows so much more of what's going on in the details. So I recently posted on Twitter that I find the speedrunning community really fascinating. So speedrunning, for those of you who have never heard of this before, is people who try to beat video games as fast as possible. And I don't really care so much about video games. I don't play that much anymore. And I don't even really enjoy watching the speed runs so much. I find that if I don't know the game, I don't really find them that entertaining. But what I find really interesting is that people get like insanely good at these video games. And so I think this is a really potent metaphor for how do people get really good at other things. And one of the factors that seems to be really important is the fact that the way you demonstrate that you beat a game in a certain amount of time is you post the live replay, or you post a video of you doing it. And what this allows is anyone else who wants to beat you now knows how you did it, right? They know exactly what you did. Whereas in a lot of other domains of human performance, you know, if I go to an art museum and I want to see a Van Gogh painting, I actually don't know how he did it, right? I can make some estimations. If I'm a bit of an expert, I can say, well, he was probably using this pigment and he probably used these kinds of brush strokes and he was going this fast just based on the physics. So there's a little bit of reconstruction I can do, but most of it's invisible. And I think even for a lot of Renaissance masters, there's still a lot of open questions about how they actually did some of their paintings. And so that is why if you were trying to become a good painter in, 16th century Italy, you went to a workshop and you studied under one of these people. You didn't just go to museums and take notes. You went and you saw them doing the painting. And so I feel like live streaming or watching live streams or even being in a community where you can witness people is often very valuable for the learning process. I don't mention it as much in Ultralearning because access to these communities themselves can be its own challenge, but I won't say that they're a bad step. I think if you can get involved in a situation where there's people programming around you and you can ask them questions and you can see how they're doing stuff, you will learn how to code faster than if you're doing it entirely on your own.
Yeah, that there's the popular narrative surrounding a lot of that stuff is probably more along the lines of like, oh, well, it just shows that it's possible. So then everyone else is figuring out how to do it. Which, the most common example of that is like the 4-minute mile that Roger Bannister run. And then like all of a sudden a bunch of people are running it, which actually, I mean, I've seen some pretty interesting stuff pretty solidly debunking that and saying actually like all the men who were running track were involved in some world wars. And then like the record just stagnated based upon that since all the running records across the board sort of got stuck for like a period of time. And then when the next generation of track athletes came along, like records for, the mile, 10K, 5K, et cetera, were all changing, even though none of those other things were stuck at like salient times, like 4 minutes or whatever.
Yeah.
But side note on that, but it's not just the reframing of what's possible. It's actually the ability to see exactly what people are doing, because a lot of what they're doing, like you mentioned, is potentially tacit or something that they can't articulate. But when you watch it, you're like, oh, wow, okay, I'm going to just copy that and do it that way.
So I think you're absolutely right. I do think that there is some kind of possibility motivation when we're talking about things, although what's the exact split between just knowing something is possible versus having some inkling of how they're doing it? I think even when we're looking at innovation at a society-wide level, like, as soon as the United States builds nuclear weapons, it was something that other countries were building at a faster rate and stuff. And some of that might be leaked information and science. But as soon as you know that someone did something in a certain kind of general way, you already have a lot of inclination about, well, how do they do it versus what ways could they have possibly not used because they didn't have the resources or time or what have you. And so for me, I feel like even the value of a lot of my projects where you can't see me doing it constantly, there's a sense of, well, this kind of thing might be possible. Like for me, when I was learning languages, being introduced to Benny Lewis was such a big inspiration for me not because, I knew exactly how he was doing it or because, he was perfect in every way of doing his approach, but it already kind of tightened me like, if you want to learn a language quickly, it's got to be in this ballpark of methods and not the way that I was doing it, right? So I think that can be very valuable to just witness people who are high performing, even if it's low resolution, just because it limits the kind of dead ends that you go down.
Yeah, and that the amount of chunking that those individuals have already potentially done then gives the next crop of people something to build off of, right? I mean, video games is an obvious example of that, where it's like, you beat this part like this, and someone figures that out, and then they're like, okay, well, how can I potentially even go faster? Well, you already chunked the game into these chunks, and now I get to see this little piece here where I can go like this and use this platform to jump off of and go even faster.
Or even just like people recognizing that theoretically you could do this, but it's like no one's proficient enough at it to like take advantage of it. Honestly, I'm just so fascinated by speedrunning because I just see it as being like this entire little universe of everything we're trying to accomplish, and seeing how like these processes of feedback and environmental and social learning just kind of come into play. I'm waiting for someone to write a book that's explaining all of this, but maybe I'll be waiting for a while, or I'll have to write it myself. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, you got the skills to pump out books on learning.
Pump out books on learning. Yeah, I think describing this book as being pumped out is this was a very, very long and painful 3-year labor for me to get this book out. So I hope it was worth it in the end, but it was definitely I couldn't describe it as being pumped out.
3 years of
agonizingly wrung from the cloth of my mind, maybe, but
extruded.
Yes, extruded. Yes,
slowly extruded.
Yes, excruciating. Yeah, these are probably better adjectives to describe my writing process.
A very viscous fluid, slowly extruded over 3 years.
Yeah.
Well, and to touch on that, the video game example again, I think that what's also interesting about that is, right, video games have very defined rules and very clear success or failure. So that probably is a laboratory potentially to really see some of this stuff in action, because it's very obvious whether you did the thing or not. And then it just gets a little bit more complex as there's less clear environments or areas where there's not as clear of like, yes, you did it, or no, you didn't.
Well, I think that's one of the reasons why we haven't had like ultra learning competitions, for instance, is just that the kinds of things that tend to get in this positive feedback loop of intense competitive effort tend to be those things that are very standardized, that they have clear success metrics, and that there is a fairly level playing field. Whereas learning things is definitely not that, because there's so much influence of background knowledge. It's really like, how would you make it fair? So we have some intellectual competitions. I know there's some memory competitions, but it tends to be memorizing like useless stuff. Whereas, who can learn the language the fastest contest doesn't exist, because depending on what your background is, that task can be orders of magnitude harder or easier. And so it's really hard to get that kind of clean competitiveness of like, competitor A is using method X to learn a language and competitor B is using method Y, and you don't have that innovation. And so for me, writing this book was a lot of trying to synthesize and bring together efforts that, like, from a superficial standpoint, don't seem commensurate at all. Like Eric Barone spending 5 years painstakingly developing the skill of building a video game is not at all like Benny Lewis going to a new country and learning a language, but it was just me trying to do the mental work of extracting those principles, so that despite the fact that learning is kind of the most unlevel of playing fields and not suitable for competition, we can nonetheless learn from it and hopefully adapt our own process to improve as a result.
Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, we've been talking mostly about the book Ultralearning, which, I read and enjoyed. And I would say that for people who, have already been involved in some projects related to figuring things out on their own, or with some guidance, right, in like an informal setting, that there's like a lot of really good ideas in there to potentially improve your process. And like you said, you've chunked things into some buckets that can help, really crystallize like, oh, okay, this is a good way to think about this, or, oh, wow, I've really been wasting my time, just reviewing my notes all the time, et cetera. And then for people who maybe haven't dug so deep into trying to figure some stuff out on their own, that it's at least like a map for how the process could potentially work, and shows some pretty salient examples of people figuring things out, which makes it seem way less, just overwhelming. Like, oh, this is impossible. I'm not smart enough. I'm not talented enough, whatever. So this book, I mean, what's the deal with it? What should people do if they want it?
Well, if you want to get the book, you can just Google Ultralearning. It's going to be on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, wherever you get your books. It should be available, at least online at the very least. You can also go to my website at scotthyoung.com, and I have, in addition to this book, and I have links to the book where you can get it from different places, I also have thousands of articles that I've written about learning and habits and self-improvement and life philosophy and rationality and all sorts of topics like that. So if you've enjoyed this conversation, if you've listened to this point, then you might as well check out the website and check out a few articles. And I would love to hear if anyone does get the book. Obviously, it's a big compliment to me if after you read this, you decide to get the book, but it's an even bigger compliment if you read it, and an even bigger one than that if you decide to do something with it. And so I know a lot of the people listening here probably are smart learners who have learned lots of things before. But I will say as well that in doing the research for the book, I try to include some things that, even after doing this for years and being aware of this, things that even surprised me. So I'm assuming that no matter what your level is, I think there's going to be some stuff that you will find interesting. And I would really, really like to know if anyone, takes up the mantle and decides to try an Ultralearning project and what comes of it.
Yeah, definitely. And the blog too, I think is, you touched on it briefly, but, it's you blog multiple, even several times per week. And it's consistently insightful, right? Which is pretty remarkable. Just the amount of like, oh, okay, yeah, that's a good idea. Oh, that's a good idea. Oh, wow, that's a good idea. How do you pull that off?
Oh, barely. No, I was writing for once a week for a while, and then I just decided, well, let's do this little experiment to write more frequently. So now I'm writing just too much. I'm writing a lot. So there's about 5 articles a week. But if you sign up to the newsletter, we just pick the best article and give that whole text, and then just links to the other ones at the bottom. And so in some ways, if you subscribe to the newsletter, you get the like curated version. This is like the best version of the blog, because it's kind of like a survival of the fittest of which pieces my team thought were best for that week. But yeah, it's definitely a challenge to keep up with the writing output. I don't know when this podcast is released whether I'm going to be keeping up with that exactly, but I definitely like writing and thinking about these ideas, and that's sort of my passion in life.
There we go. Yeah, so highly recommended to both check out the book and the blog. And Scott, thank you for your wisdom on wisdom.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for listening all the way through. I admire your grit, your persistence, and your perseverance. Since you made it, I have a few favors to ask of you. Go ahead and open up the show notes on whatever podcast player you use. In there, you'll find links to all the resources that were mentioned throughout the show. There's also some links there in which you can leave a review or subscribe to the show. And podcasters are always harping on this because this actually makes a difference in terms of the algorithms that recommend podcasts to new people. So if you do that, it helps more people find the show. And if you head over to toddneef.com, you can sign up to receive most of my thoughts and writing, which really only go out to the email list. A lot of it never makes it to the blog or the podcast. So if you like what I have to say and you want to see some of my recommendations and stuff that I've been checking out, go ahead and subscribe to that email newsletter as well.